From the Toronto Star, I'm Robert Benzie, and this matters.
Hello, I'm Robert Benzie. I'm the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Ontario is headed toward an early election. Even though an election doesn't actually have to be held until June 2026 under Ontario's fixed election date law that posits that elections be held every 4 years, Premier Doug Ford is going to visit the Lieutenant Governor, Edith Dumont, next week, and he's going to ask her to drop the writs, and that will mean an election will be held on February 27th. That's more than a year and a bit ahead of the scheduled vote. Premier Doug Ford is headed to the polls early because it's good for him to do so. There are many reasons for this. Here's a couple. First, he's doing very well in the public opinion polls. He has been looking for a reason to have an election since last May because his polling has been so good. So that's one reason. A second reason is that Premier Ford wants to get in front of the federal election that will likely come in May. In Ontario, voters tend to prefer two different parties in power at the same time, federally and provincially. That means when the Conservatives are doing well at Queen's Park, the Liberals tend to be doing well in Ottawa, and vice versa. Because Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is likely to win the next federal election and become Prime Minister, that could be bad for the provincial Progressive Conservatives. Even though they're different parties, Mr. Ford knows that history suggests that will be good for the Liberals or the New Democrats at Queen's Park. Third reason that Mr. Ford wants to have an election is he wants to get in front of the Greenbelt investigation that the RCMP has been conducting since October 2023. That's the police probe into the $8.28 billion land swap of 7,400 acres of ecologically sensitive land around Toronto. Mr. Ford initially opened it up for development, and the Auditor General and the Integrity Commissioner found that conservative connected developers were favored, quote unquote, in that process. Mr. Ford since backed off the opening up of that land, but the police have still swooped in. He has denied any wrongdoing, the premier has, but detectives have spoken to at least a dozen current and former aides to the premier, and their investigation is continuing. So there are some fears in conservative circles that someone in Mr. Ford's orbit, not necessarily a politician or an aide, but someone in his orbit could face charges if the police do in fact lay charges. So that's something they want to get in front of. The fourth reason is that the Liberals are in a bit of disarray. The federal Liberals are currently in a leadership contest. That means Liberal resources are focused on whether Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland or Karina Gould or any of the other candidates will be the next leader of the federal Liberal Party and therefore the next prime minister to succeed Justin Trudeau. Mr. Ford knows in provincial Liberals who should be helping Bonnie Crombie may be distracted by the federal Liberal leadership contest. That's why Mr. Ford has a very narrow window in which to hold an election. The federal Liberal leadership will be determined on March 9th. So he wants to get in front of that. So that's why the two dates that they circled were February 27th and March 6th, because Ontario elections have to be held on a Thursday. Both NDP leader Marit Stiles and Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, who are the main rivals to Mr. Ford's Progressive Conservatives, have said he does not need to have an election. Mr. Ford has claimed he needs to hold one now because Donald Trump's threatened tariffs against Ontario could mean the loss of 500,000 jobs, and that will entail tens of billions of dollars in stimulus spending. Ms. Crombie and Ms. Stiles have said, look, we will work with you. We will not oppose a stimulus package. By the way, Mr. Ford already has a majority in the legislature, so getting a stimulus package through would not be a problem. But Mr. Ford counters and said, look, politicians shouldn't write blank checks. I need a fresh mandate from the people because people are going to have to say, do they want this stimulus or do they not want this stimulus? So the threat of Trump tariffs, that's been the latest rationale, some say pretense, for an election. But Mr. Ford has turned that around and said to the opposition leaders, look, you may say you support me now, but I need a fresh mandate from the people. Both Crombie and Stiles say that the real reason Mr. Ford wants to hold an election is he's worried about the RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt and also about the softening economy. Some of the issues that we're going to see in this election are the doctor shortage. There's about 2.5 million Ontarians who don't have access to a family doctor. We saw in a front page story in the Star by Megan Ogilvy that 500 people lined up in the snow in Walkerton, Ontario, just so they could get a doctor. Some were in line for 6 hours. That's a very bad look for the provincial government. And the Tories are mindful that they have to do something. That's why they have Dr. Jane Philpott, a former federal Liberal minister, who is helping them rethink primary care reform so that people have more access to a family doctor. But that will take a lot of time. The Conservatives know this is vulnerability, and so do the Liberals and the New Democrats, and that's why they're talking so much about the doctor shortage. Another major issue is the economy. Unemployment is rising at 7.5%, and people are concerned about what the Trump tariffs will do to Ontario's economy. So there's a real concern about that. And housing remains a huge, huge issue in Ontario. Mr. Ford's Conservatives have promised to build 1.5 million new homes in the province by 2031. But that entails housing starts on average of 150,000 a year. The best year they've had is about 100,000. So they are way behind that target. And the housing problems are why he opened up the Greenbelt. So it's one of these things that you open a can of worms, and there's a lot of other things that happen when you do that. And this is a big problem. Housing affordability, homelessness. We see 81,000 people in Ontario, according to the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, are homeless in the province. That is staggering. That's the population of the city of Peterborough, basically. Popular premiers in the past have called snap elections even when they didn't have to. The most notorious example in Ontario and it is in 1990 when Premier David Peterson, full disclosure, Mr. Peterson is now the chair of Torstar, the parent company of the Toronto Star. Mr. Peterson called an early election in 1990. He was at 50% in the polls at that time and wanted to get ahead of some economic bad news. That's why a lot of people in political circles in Ontario are studying this famous book. This is a 1991 book by Georgette Gagnon and Dan Rath called Not Without Cause. And it is the story, the inside story of the demise of Mr. Peterson's Liberal government and the hubris that led to that calling of an early election that saw Bob Rae's New Democrats win and Mr. Peterson lose his own seat, actually. It was a stunning upset and one of the biggest in the history of Canadian politics. So a lot of Conservatives are studying this book. It's been out of print for years, and so many people are looking at this book that it's now going for $72 on Amazon because it's rare hard copies are much sought after. And it's a cautionary tale, and I think a lot of people are looking at that. Another historical example that the Conservatives are looking at warily is the 2021 federal election that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called when things in the pandemic were starting to slow down, and he'd had a good run. Mr. Trudeau, who had won a minority government in 2019, he thought, I'm going to finally get my majority. And he went into 2021 and voters said, not so fast, and gave him another minority government. That's the same one that we're currently in now. So those are historical precedents that the progressive Conservatives have looked at. Some of them are poring over not without cause and worried that history might repeat itself. But conservative strategists say this is the best time for them to have an election because the future could be more troubling with Donald Trump, with a slowing economy, and many other factors. And as Harold Macmillan, the famous British Prime Minister, said, events. They just don't know what the future holds.
That's it for today, but clearly there's a lot more to come. Thanks for listening, and thanks for reading the Toronto Star, and we'll talk soon.